A little homeless girl begs Johnny Depp for help, then he notices something important and immediately takes action. Between towering glass monoliths of downtown, Johnny Depp emerged from the grand entrance of a luxury hotel. The air was filled with the usual urban symphony, car horns honking in the distance, the chatter of passers-by, and the faint rumble of construction work echoing from a few blocks away. Johnny, dressed in his signature eclectic style, sunglasses perched on his nose, made his way towards the sleek black limousine waiting at the curb. His chauffeur, a tall man in his 50s named Thomas, stood at attention beside the vehicle. With practiced efficiency, Thomas opened the rear door as Johnny approached. "Good morning, Mr. Depp," he said with a polite nod. "I trust you had a pleasant stay?" Johnny returned the greeting with a warm smile. "Morning, Thomas. It was fine, thanks. Looking forward to getting back home, though, but we still need to make one more stop for a photo shoot session." As Johnny was about to slide into the plush leather interior of the limo, a small figure darted past him, moving with surprising speed. Before he could fully register what was happening, he felt something latch onto his leg. Looking down, he saw a little girl, completely bald, clinging to him with all her might. Her body trembled, and her eyes remained fixed on something in the distance, refusing to meet his gaze. Caught off guard, Johnny gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to catch her eye. "Are you all right?" Before the child could respond, an angry shout pierced the air. The girl's grip on Johnny's leg tightened for a moment, before she abruptly let go and fled without a word, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians. A red-faced man in his 40s, wearing an apron emblazoned with the logo of a nearby convenience store, approached Johnny. His eyes were still focused on the direction the girl had run, not yet registering who he was addressing. "That little brat," the man spat, his words laced with bitterness. "She's always hanging around my store, scaring away customers. Brings nothing but bad luck, I tell you." Johnny raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Has she actually done anything wrong? Steal something?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a hint of challenge. The store owner, still caught up in his rant, went on, "No, she doesn't actually steal anything. She just strolls through the aisles, looking and touching everything, always touching, never buying. It's unsettling, I tell you. My regulars don't like it, and neither do I. I think it's all part of her plan, biding her time until I let my guard down so she can steal something. She needs to learn to stay away from—" Mid-sentence, the man's eyes finally focused on Johnny, and recognition dawned on his face. His anger evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of embarrassment and awe. "Oh my God," he stammered, his cheeks flushing an even deeper shade of red. You're Johnny Depp. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't realize I didn't mean to—" Johnny held up a hand, silencing the man's flustered apologies. "It's all right," he said, his tone measured. "But let me ask you again, has this girl ever actually broken or disrupted anything from your store?" The store owner shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Johnny and the direction the girl had fled. "Well, no, I told you," he admitted reluctantly. "But she's always there. It's not right." Johnny nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice taking on a gentle, almost philosophical tone, "I've learned in my life that it's not wise to judge people for crimes they haven't committed. Maybe there's more to her story than meets the eye." With that, Johnny turned and slid into the waiting limousine. Thomas closed the door behind him, muffling the store owner's final bitter retort. "I don't like you celebrities anyway," the man muttered, his voice barely audible through the tinted glass. "Never care about what's really going on in the world." As the limousine pulled away from the curb, Johnny leaned back in his seat, his mind still on the strange encounter. The girl's frightened eyes and the store owner's misplaced anger lingered in his thoughts as the city scenery began to roll by outside the window. As the limousine merged into the morning traffic, Johnny leaned forward, addressing his chauffeur. "Thomas," he said, his voice carrying a note of urgency, "could you drive a bit slower than usual? I want to keep an eye out for something." Thomas nodded, adjusting his speed accordingly. "Of course, Mr. Departamento. Is everything all right?" Johnny's gaze swept the streets through the tinted windows, his eyes sharp and searching for any trace of the little girl he'd just seen. "I'm not sure," he said, his brow knitted in focus. There was a child back there. I need to make sure she's okay. She's bald, looks like 9 or 10 years old. Help me look for her. Surely, sir, came the quick response, steady and reassuring. The city landscape rolled by at a more leisurely pace, bustling sidewalks filled with morning commuters, street vendors setting up their carts, and the occasional group of tourists already out exploring. Johnny's gaze darted from person to person, looking for that small, bald head in the sea of faces. Just as he was about to give up hope, he spotted a familiar figure huddled against the wall outside another convenience store at the next block. "Thomas," he said quickly, "could you pull over here, please?" The limousine came to a smooth stop, and Johnny stepped out onto the sidewalk, his signature sunglasses in place. He approached the girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. She sat on the ground, a small paper cup extended in front of her for donations. Her posture spoke of exhaustion and resignation, but as Johnny drew near, her eyes lit up with recognition. Johnny crouched down to her level, offering a gentle smile. "Hello again," he said softly. He reached into his wallet, pulling out several large bills and placing them in her cup. The girl's eyes widened at the generous donation, and without warning, she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around Johnny's leg once more. This time, however, the embrace was one of joy rather than fear. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against the fabric of his pants. Then, looking up at him with wonder in her eyes, she asked, "Are you Captain Jack Sparrow? Where's your ship?" Johnny couldn't help but chuckle, the girl's innocence and enthusiasm warming his heart despite the sadness of her situation. "Well, love," he said, slipping into his Jack Sparrow voice, "the Black Pearl is safely anchored in a secret cove waiting for her next adventure. But tell me, what's a brave little pirate like yourself doing out here all alone?" The girl's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around nervously before looking back at Johnny. "Captain Jack Sparrow," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "please help me." Johnny's hand moved towards his wallet again, but the girl shook her head vigorously. "Not money," she said, her eyes pleading. "I need—" Before she could finish her sentence, a small crowd started to form around them. Fans, recognizing Johnny, approached with phones in hand, calling his name and eagerly asking for pictures. Some murmured questions, speculating about what the celebrity was doing with the homeless girl. The girl flinched, shrinking back as the growing attention overwhelmed her. A few pushed closer, unintentionally jostling him as they vied for his attention. Johnny instinctively took a step back, his calm demeanor barely faltering as he moved toward the limousine. Thomas, ever watchful, stepped in swiftly. "All right, folks, give him some space," he said firmly, his imposing presence cutting through the commotion. Guiding Johnny with a hand on his shoulder, he opened the limo door and ushered him inside with practiced ease. Once inside, Johnny glanced back through the window, his brow furrowed with concern as the girl disappeared into the crowd. "Mr. Depp, I'm sorry, but we should go. Your schedule," Thomas began, his tone firm but polite. When there was no response, he leaned slightly closer. "Mr. Depp?" Johnny eventually turned away from the window, his expression distant and preoccupied. "Yeah, I heard you," he murmured to Thomas, his voice unusually soft. His eyes flicked back to the busy street for a moment, before he straightened in his seat. "I'll be back," he whispered under his breath, a quiet promise meant for the girl. As he spoke, Thomas signaled the driver to merge into traffic. Once they were moving again, Johnny's phone rang. He answered to find an event organizer on the other end, confirming his attendance at an upcoming magazine photo shoot. "Yes, everything's still on schedule. I'm on my way," Johnny assured them, even as his thoughts remained fixed on the girl he'd left behind. As he ended the call, he turned to Thomas with a determined look. "We have a few minutes to spare, right?" Thomas checked the time and nodded. "About 5 minutes, sir, if we're to arrive on time for your appointment." "Then let's go back," Johnny said firmly. "There's something I need to do." The limousine smoothly navigated the city streets, retracing their route with practiced efficiency. Johnny's eyes remained fixed on the passing scenery, searching for any sign of the little girl. As they approached the spot where he had last seen her, his heart sank. The crowd had dispersed, and there was no sign of the child. "Pull over here, Thomas," Johnny instructed as they reached the convenience store. "I'll be back in a moment." As Johnny stepped out of the car, he turned to his chauffeur. "I'm just going to take a quick look inside the store. I won't be long." The bell above the door chimed softly as Johnny entered the store. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the aisles of snacks and household items. Behind the counter, a teenage cashier was deeply engrossed in a mobile game, barely glancing up as Johnny walked in. Moving quietly through the store, Johnny scanned each aisle systematically. His eyes darted from shelf to shelf, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of the small figure he'd encountered earlier. The only sounds were the beeping of the cashier's game and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. After a thorough search yielded no results, Johnny approached the counter. The cashier finally looked up from his phone, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the customer standing before him. "Excuse me," Johnny said politely. "I'm looking for a little girl. Bald head, about this tall." He gestured with his hand to indicate the child's height. "Have you seen anyone like that in here recently?" The cashier's expression remained blank as he shook his head. "Nah, man. Haven't seen any kids in here today." Without waiting for a response, he turned his attention back to his game. Disappointed but not deterred, Johnny thanked the cashier and stepped back out onto the street. The afternoon sun beat down as he took several steps in each direction, scanning the nearby alleys and sidewalks. He was acutely aware that his time was limited before fans might recognize him again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the girl needed help. After a few more minutes of fruitless searching, Johnny reluctantly returned to the waiting limousine. As he settled into the back seat, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through his calendar and agenda. The list of appointments and commitments stretched out before him, a stark reminder of the demands of his professional life. Thomas started the engine, ready to continue their journey to the photo shoot. As the car eased down the street, moving toward the next block, Johnny remained lost in his thoughts. "Maybe she's gone for good," he mused. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space, until a soft knock on the window broke the stillness. Slowly he turned, blinking in surprise. There, just outside, was a small face pressed against the glass, tiny hands cupped around her eyes as she gazed intently into the tinted interior. His heart leapt as he recognized the little girl from earlier, her bald head unmistakable even through the darkened glass. He suddenly realized that the limousine had come to a stop at a traffic light. His eyes darted to the traffic signal countdown, which showed only a few seconds remaining before the light would change. Without hesitation, Johnny reached for the door handle, ready to speak with her again and finally uncover the mystery of her plea for help. "Come on," Johnny said urgently to the girl, making a split-second decision. Without hesitation, he swung the door open and helped her into the back seat, just before the light could turn green. The soft creak of the leather seats echoed as she settled beside him, her small frame seeming even more fragile against the plush interior of the vehicle. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyebrows raised in surprise, but he said nothing as the light turned green and he smoothly accelerated. Inside the climate-controlled environment of the limousine, the girl seemed to relax slightly. Her wide eyes took in the plush surroundings, a stark contrast to the streets she had been inhabiting. Johnny watched her carefully, noticing how she unconsciously rubbed her arms as if cold, despite the comfortable temperature in the car. "What's your name?" Johnny asked gently, trying to put her at ease. The girl hesitated for a moment before answering in a small voice. "Sonia." "It's nice to meet you properly, Sonia," Johnny said with a warm smile. "Now can you tell me what kind of help you need?" Instead of answering directly, Sonia pointed through the window to a building they were passing. Johnny followed her gesture and saw a large sign that read "Orphanage" on the front of an old, somewhat run-down structure. Before he could ask for clarification, Sonia made another gesture, this time more personal and troubling. She indicated her bald head and then pulled up her sleeve, revealing a dark, concerning mark on her arm. "Please help, sir," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. The plea carried new weight with these visual clues, and Johnny felt a knot forming in his stomach as he began to piece together the situation. Leaning closer, Johnny carefully studied the mark on Sonia's arm. His expression grew serious as he processed what he was seeing. The combination of her bald head, pale skin, and the suspicious mark led him to a sobering conclusion about her medical condition. "Sonia," he said softly, his voice filled with concern, "are you sick? Is that why you need help?" The girl nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "The doctors at the orphanage said I need special medicine, but they don't have enough money. I've been trying to save up, but—" Her voice trailed off as she gestured helplessly at her meager possessions. The gravity of the situation settled over the car's interior like a heavy blanket. Without hesitation, Johnny turned to address his chauffeur. "Thomas, can you find parking near that orphanage we just passed? We need to speak with someone there." "Of course, Mr. Depp," Thomas replied, already changing lanes to turn around. As they approached the orphanage, Johnny's attention remained fixed on Sonia. He noticed how she seemed to shrink into herself as they got closer to the building, her earlier bravery giving way to apprehension. "It's going to be okay," Johnny assured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're going to figure this out together, all right?" Sonia nodded, managing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The limousine came to a stop in front of the orphanage, and Johnny helped Sonia out of the car. As they approached the entrance, he noticed her steps becoming slower, more hesitant. The short flight of stairs leading to the front door seemed to loom before them like a mountain. Just as they reached the bottom step, Sonia's legs gave out beneath her. Johnny instinctively reached out to catch her, but she was already losing her balance. His grip slowed her descent, preventing her from falling too quickly. But in a heart-stopping moment, she tumbled the last few steps, her small body crashing onto the pavement below. "Sonia!" Johnny cried out, rushing to her side. He gently cradled her head, relieved to see that she was still conscious, but alarmed by the trickle of blood from a cut on her forehead. Without wasting a moment, Johnny pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. As he quickly explained the situation to the operator, his free hand stayed on Sonia's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could while trying to keep her still. She was conscious. Wasn't that a good sign, he thought, but his mind raced with concern, hoping she hadn't broken any bones in that fragile little body. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across her pale face, highlighting the fear and pain in her eyes. Johnny's heart raced as he waited for the ambulance to arrive, acutely aware of how fragile the little girl in front of him truly was. As Johnny ended the call with emergency services, the front door of the orphanage burst open. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun rushed out, her face etched with concern. "Oh, dear Lord," she exclaimed, hurrying down the steps as quickly as her age would allow. "What happened? Is she all right?" Johnny looked up, his hand still resting protectively on Sonia's shoulder. "She collapsed on the stairs," he explained quickly. "I've called for an ambulance." The woman knelt beside them, her movements surprisingly spry for her age. "I'm Miss Abigail," she said, her voice carrying both authority and genuine concern. "I'm the caregiver and owner of the orphanage. We saw what happened on our security cameras, and I came as fast as I could." Miss Abigail gently brushed Sonia's cheek, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and affection. "Oh, Sonia," she murmured, "what have you gotten yourself into this time?" Turning to Johnny, Miss Abigail's expression grew more somber. "I'm afraid Sonia has been diagnosed with cancer, and because of her condition, she's been experiencing weakness and imbalance. She falls quite frequently. We've been doing everything we can to manage her care, but—" Her voice faltered, and she trailed off, her eyes misting over with unshed tears. Before Johnny could respond, the wail of sirens pierced the air. An ambulance rounded the corner, its lights flashing as it pulled up to the curb. 2 paramedics quickly exited the vehicle, wheeling a stretcher between them. As the paramedics began to assess Sonia's condition, her small voice broke through the commotion. "Captain Sparrow," she called weakly, reaching out for Johnny's hand. "Will you come with me, please?" Johnny's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He glanced at Miss Abigail, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Sonia," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I'll be right there with you." However, As the paramedics prepared to load Sonia into the ambulance, one of them turned to Johnny with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can only allow one person to ride along, and it should be her guardian." Johnny nodded in understanding, then leaned down to speak to Sonia. "Listen, sweetheart," he said softly. "Ms. Abigail is going to ride with you in the ambulance, but I promise I'll meet you at the hospital, okay? My ship will be right behind you." Sonia's lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. "You promise?" "Pirate's honor," Johnny replied with a wink, earning a small smile from the girl. As the paramedics loaded Sonia into the ambulance, Ms. Abigail climbed in beside her. The doors closed, and the vehicle pulled away, its sirens now silent, but lights still flashing. Johnny turned to Thomas, who had been waiting quietly nearby. "We're going to follow them to the hospital," he said firmly. "Can you keep up with the ambulance?" Thomas nodded, already moving towards the limousine. "Of course, Mr. Depp, I'll make sure we don't lose sight of them." As they settled into the car and began to follow the ambulance through the city traffic, Johnny sat quietly in the back seat, his mind racing. Questions about Sonia's condition, her life at the orphanage, and how he could help swirled through his thoughts. Thomas navigated the streets with practiced skill, maintaining a respectful distance from the ambulance while ensuring they didn't fall behind. The city passed by in a blur of buildings and faces, but Johnny's focus remained fixed on the vehicle ahead, carrying the little girl who had so unexpectedly entered his life. The emergency room bustled with activity as Johnny made his way through the sliding doors. The antiseptic smell and harsh fluorescent lighting created a stark contrast to the warm afternoon he'd left behind. He approached the nurse's station, inquiring about Sonia's whereabouts. "She's being examined by the doctor now," the nurse informed him, gesturing towards a curtained area. "Are you family?" Johnny hesitated for a moment before responding, "I'm a friend. I brought her in." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "You can wait outside the curtain. The doctor should be out soon to give an update." As Johnny settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair outside Sonia's room, he spotted Ms. Abigail pacing nearby. Her eyes met his as he approached, and relief washed over her face. The heavy silence between them grew, the weight of the situation pressing in, until Ms. Abigail suddenly stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening with recognition. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her voice catching in surprise. "Sir, you're Johnny Depp. I'm so sorry, I didn't even realize. How did you become involved in all this?" Johnny briefly recounted his earlier encounters with Sonia, from the moment she grabbed his leg outside the hotel to their meeting at the traffic light. Ms. Abigail listened intently, her expression a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "Oh, Mr. Depp, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I feel I owe you an explanation about Sonia's situation." Johnny nodded encouragingly, and Ms. Abigail took a deep breath before continuing. "The truth is, our orphanage has been struggling financially for years," Ms. Abigail began, her gaze dropping to the floor. "We do our best to care for the children, but when Sonia was diagnosed with stage 3 malignant melanoma, we found ourselves completely out of our depth. The treatment she needs, it's far beyond what we can afford, and her condition has only worsened over the past year." Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "Sonia overheard the doctors discussing her condition. She knew how serious it was, and I think that's why she's been so reluctant to return to the orphanage lately. She's been begging on the streets, trying to save money for her own treatment." The revelation hit Johnny like a physical blow. Suddenly, Sonia's behavior, her presence in stores, her desperation, made tragic sense. "That's probably why she was in those shops?" Johnny asked, more to himself than to Ms. Abigail. "She was seeking shelter from the sun?" Ms. Abigail nodded, her expression heavy with sadness. "Yes, and trying to stay warm. The poor dear. I've received so many complaints from local store owners about her presence, but she never told us why she was really there. It's becoming harder to keep her inside the orphanage." Just as Ms. Abigail finished her explanation, Johnny's phone began to ring. "I'm sorry, I need to take this, Ms. Abigail. We'll talk soon." He excused himself, stepping away to answer the call. It was the event organizer from the photo shoot he was supposed to attend. "Mr. Depp," the voice on the other end said, clearly agitated. "Where are you? We've been waiting for over an hour. The entire shoot is behind schedule." Johnny paced further down the sterile hospital hallway, carefully avoiding curious eyes and ears, searching for a quiet place to speak. After a moment of hesitation, he made a quick decision. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "I won't be able to make it. There's been an emergency." The organizer's tone shifted from frustration to disbelief. "An emergency? Mr. Depp, you said that everything's a schedule. This shoot has been planned for months. The contract clearly states—" "I understand," Johnny interrupted, his voice calm but resolute. "And I'll accept whatever penalties are in the contract. But right now there's something more important that needs my attention." Without waiting for a response, Johnny ended the call. He knew there would be consequences, financial penalties, possibly even damage to professional relationships. But as he looked back towards the curtained area where Sonia lay, he knew he had made the right choice. Returning to Ms. Abigail, Johnny found her wiping away tears. "Mr. Depp," she began, her voice filled with gratitude, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done already. But I have to ask, what happens now?" Johnny's gaze shifted from Miss Abigail to the curtain hiding Sonia from view, then back again. In that moment, the contrast between his privileged position and Sonia's desperate situation crystallized his resolve. "Now," he said with quiet determination, "we make sure Sonia gets the treatment she needs. And while we wait for the doctor, tell me about your orphanage, Miss Abigail." Miss Abigail took a deep breath, her eyes steady but tinged with exhaustion. "The orphanage is called Hope's Haven," she began softly. "We've been running it for over 20 years, but it's been getting harder with each passing year. It's located in the heart of the city, so the costs are overwhelming. Rent is high and the space is limited. The building itself is old, no modern amenities, and it's been tough keeping it safe and comfortable for the children. We've had to make do with what we have, but it's barely enough. There's no room to expand, and with the rising costs of everything, it's been a struggle just to keep the doors open. Some of the staff, and even I, have to volunteer from our own pocket just to keep things running." She hesitated, a tired sigh escaping her lips. "We manage, but it's getting harder every day. The city's growing, but we feel like we're being squeezed out. It's difficult to give the children what they need when everything else feels like it's slipping through our fingers." She paused for a moment, her hands wringing together in her lap. "We do our best to care for the children, but there's only so much we can do. Sonia's situation, it's just we can't bear it alone." Johnny listened quietly, the weight of Miss Abigail's words settling in. His expression softened, and after a moment of thought he looked at her with a steady gaze. "Miss Abigail, I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "And I'm sure Sonia deserves so much more than what circumstances have allowed. I want to help." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I'll cover the cost of Sonia's treatment, her hospitalization, everything she needs to get better. You shouldn't have to carry that burden alone, especially when there's a chance for her to get the care she deserves." Johnny's voice remained firm but gentle as he added, "You've done everything you can for her, and now it's my turn to step in." Ms. Abigail's eyes widened in disbelief. "But the cost, we could never—" Johnny held up a hand, silencing her protests. "The orphanage don't have to pay back. Leave that to me," he said softly. "No child should have to beg on the streets for a chance at life. We're going to change that starting today." As the gravity of Sonia's situation settled over him, Johnny found himself restless with the need to do something, anything. He turned to Ms. Abigail. "I'll be right back," he said quickly, already walking towards the nearby nurse's station, his steps purposeful. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady but urgent. "I'd like to have Sonia moved to a more private room once the ER team is done," he said. The nurse glanced up at him, nodding in acknowledgement. "Of course, Mr. Depp. However, we'll need to run some tests on her first. We'll be conducting a CT scan to check for any potential concussion. It's standard procedure after a fall like hers." Johnny's brow furrowed. but his voice remained calm. "Okay, do what must be done. I want the best possible care for her," he replied firmly, giving the nurse a reassuring nod. The nurse gave him a brief, understanding smile. "I'll inform you of her room number once we've completed the test." She turned back to her work, making a note in the chart before heading toward the ER curtain, her steps purposeful as she went to check on Sonia. As the nurse disappeared behind the curtain, Johnny's mind wandered briefly. He thought about how Sonia had been so brave. What could do to cheer her up after this incident? She must have been shaken enough, he thought. Then it hit him. He remembered the merchandise from Pirates of the Caribbean stashed in his limousine. A small gesture, but maybe it would bring a smile to the little girl's face, something to brighten her spirits after everything she'd been through. Johnny hurried outside the hospital, his footsteps quick as he made his way through the parking lot, his eyes scanning for the familiar silhouette of his limousine. When he reached it, he wasted no time, opening one of the storage compartments and rummaging through its contents. A triumphant smile spread across his face as his hands finally closed around the items he had been seeking: a golden pirate coin trinket and an authentic Jack Sparrow hat, both remnants from his Pirates of the Caribbean days. Before re-entering the hospital, Johnny turned to Thomas, who had been waiting patiently by the car. "Thomas," he said, "I think I'll be staying here for the night. Why don't you take the limo back and bring my regular car tomorrow? No need to attract more attention than necessary." Thomas nodded in understanding. "Of course, Mr. Depp. Shall I bring anything else for you in the morning?" Johnny thought for a moment. A change of clothes would be great, and maybe some books or games for kids. I have a feeling we might need them. With a final nod, Thomas drove off, leaving Johnny to make his way back to the hospital. As he entered the lobby, Johnny spotted a DVD vending machine. His face lit up as he saw Pirates of the Caribbean among the available titles. The machine whirred softly as it processed his payment and dispensed the movie, adding another element to his plan to lift Sonia's spirits. He walked back to the ER only to find it empty, the soft hum of the hospital filling the space. Frowning slightly, he made his way to the nurse's station. After a brief pause, he asked, "Where have they relocated Sonia?" The nurse looked up from her paperwork. "Oh, Mr. Depp," offering a quick professional smile. "She's been moved to room 207. Ms. Abigail would be there. You can head up now." "Thank you." Johnny nodded, a sense of relief washing over him, and he made his way down the corridor toward Sonia's new room. As he approached, he saw Ms. Abigail engaged in conversation with a doctor outside the room. He joined them, catching the tail end of their discussion. "Stage 3, malignant melanoma," the doctor was saying, his expression serious. "We'll need to perform surgery to remove the primary tumor and affected lymph nodes as soon as possible. After that, we're looking at a treatment plan that may include chemotherapy and radiation, depending on how she responds." Ms. Abigail's face fell at the mention of the extensive treatment. "Doctor," she began hesitantly, her voice trembling slightly, "is she going to be okay?" The doctor gave her a reassuring look, his tone steady. "From our earlier tests, the girl is stable. The CT scan revealed no concussion despite the fall, and we've addressed the wound. I believe she's in the best condition possible for the procedure. Of course, there's always risk with surgery." He paused, his gaze softening. "But we'll do everything we can, but it's too soon to say with certainty. We just need to take it one step at a time." Johnny stepped forward, cutting off her concerns. "Doctor," he said firmly, looking at his name tag, "Dr. Marvey, I want Sonia to receive the best possible care, regardless of cost. Can you make that happen?" The doctor blinked in surprise, clearly recognizing Johnny but maintaining his professional demeanor. "Of course, Mr. Depp. We have an excellent oncology team here, but I must warn you, the expenses for this kind of treatment can be substantial." Johnny nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand. Please proceed with whatever Sonia needs. I'll take care of all the expenses, and I'd appreciate if we could keep this as private as possible to avoid media attention." The doctor nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "We always maintain patient confidentiality, Mr. Depp. Now, as for the timeline, we actually have a surgery slot available tomorrow morning. Given the malignant nature of Sonia's cancer, I'd recommend we proceed as soon as possible." Johnny and Ms. Abigail exchanged a look before nodding in agreement. "Let's do it," Johnny said. "What do we need to do to prepare?" As the doctor outlined the pre-surgery procedures and necessary consent forms, Johnny felt a mix of anxiety and hope. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he was determined to do whatever it took to give Sonia a fighting chance. With the surgery scheduled for the following morning, Johnny took a deep breath and prepared to enter Sonia's room. He clutched the pirate hat and coin in one hand, the DVD in the other, hoping these small tokens might bring some comfort to the scared little girl. As he took his seat next to her bed, Sonia's eyes lit up at the sight of him. She was propped up in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the stark white sheets, but her smile was bright. "Captain Sparrow?" she exclaimed weakly, her voice filled with genuine joy. Johnny smiled warmly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Hello there, young pirate," he said, slipping easily into his Jack Sparrow voice. "I hear you're about to embark on quite the adventure." Sonia's smile faltered slightly, fear creeping into her eyes. "The doctor said they need to do surgery," she whispered. "I'm scared. I'm not as brave as you, Captain Sparrow." Johnny leaned in, his voice gentle but firm. "Now listen here, love. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you are scared. And from what I've seen, you're one of the bravest pirates I've ever met." He reached out, taking her small hand in his. "The doctors are going to help you, Sonia. They're going to fight this sickness inside you, just like we fight sea monsters in our adventures. And when it's all over, you'll be ready for new adventures. What do you say? Are you ready to be brave?" Sonia hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a determined look settling on her face. "I'll try, Captain Sparrow, I promise." Johnny smiled, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "That's my girl. Now I've brought you something special." With a flourish, he presented the pirate hat, gently placing it on Sonia's head. It was slightly too big, slipping down over her eyes, but her giggle was worth it. "And this," he said, pressing the golden coin into her palm, "is for good luck. Keep it close and remember that Captain Sparrow is rooting for you." Sonia's eyes widened as she examined the coin, turning it over in her hands with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Just then, Ms. Abigail entered the room, followed by a nurse pushing a small TV on a cart. "Look what Mr. Depp arranged for us, Sonia," Ms. Abigail said with a smile. "We're going to have a movie night." As the nurse set up the TV, Johnny turned to Sonia with a conspiratorial wink. "How about we watch some real pirate adventures?" he asked, holding up the DVD. Sonia's face lit up with excitement, but then fell slightly as she glanced at the IV in her arm. "But I'm not allowed to eat anything before the surgery," she said sadly. Johnny didn't miss a beat. "Ah, but that's part of the adventure," he exclaimed. "You see, in this movie, there are times when even Captain Sparrow goes hungry. It's all part of being a true pirate. What do you say we brave it together?" Sonia giggled and nodded, her earlier fears momentarily forgotten in the excitement of the impromptu movie night. As the opening credits began to roll, Johnny settled back in his chair, grateful for this moment of normalcy amidst the chaos of the day. He watched as Sonia became engrossed in the film, her eyes wide with wonder at the swashbuckling adventures on screen. Midway through the movie, Johnny leaned in close to Sonia, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Sonia," he asked gently, "can I ask you something? Why did you keep going into those stores if you weren't buying anything?" Sonia tore her eyes away from the screen, her expression suddenly serious. "It was always my dream to eat those snacks," she admitted quietly. "We rarely get treats like that at the orphanage. Just being there, seeing all the colorful packages, it made me feel like I could have a normal life someday." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "Plus the air conditioning felt nice, and it was good to get out of the sun. My skin don't itch too much, at least until the owners got mad and chased me out." Johnny felt his heart constrict at her words, amazed by the simple dreams of this brave little girl. He made a mental note to speak with Ms. Abigail about improving conditions at the orphanage, determined to make at least some of Sonia's dreams come true. As the movie progressed, a nurse came in to take some final measurements and blood samples for the surgery. To Johnny's relief, Sonia barely noticed, too engrossed in the adventures of Captain Jack Sparrow to pay much attention to the medical procedures. Johnny found himself sharing behind-the-scenes stories from the filming, delighting in Sonia's laughter and eager questions. For a few precious hours, the hospital room was transformed into a world of pirate adventures and Hollywood magic. As the movie neared its end, Johnny noticed Sonia's eyelids growing heavy. By the time the credits rolled, she was fast asleep, the pirate hat tilted at a jaunty angle on her head, the golden coin clutched tightly in her hand. Carefully, so as not to wake her, Johnny moved to the room's small couch and switched off the TV. As he settled in for the night, his eyes remained fixed on Sonia's peaceful form. In the quiet of the hospital room, with the soft beeping of machines providing a steady rhythm, Johnny found himself reflecting on the day's extraordinary events. He thought about the photo shoot he'd missed, the potential career repercussions, and found that none of it mattered compared to the little girl sleeping before him. As he drifted off to sleep, Johnny made a silent promise to himself and to Sonia. He would do whatever it took to see her through this battle, to give her the chance at life and adventure that every child deserves. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the hospital room's blinds when Johnny stirred from his uncomfortable sleep on the couch. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous day. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the hospital room's blinds when Johnny stirred from his uncomfortable sleep on the couch. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back to him. His gaze immediately went to Sonia's bed, where he found her already awake, clutching the pirate coin tightly in her small fist. "Good morning, Captain Jack," Sonia said softly, a brave smile trembling on her lips despite the fear evident in her eyes. Johnny quickly moved to her bedside, gently adjusting the Jack Sparrow hat that had slipped askew during the night. "Good morning, my brave little pirate," he replied warmly. "Ready for your big adventure today?" Before Sonia could answer, the door opened and a team of medical professionals entered the room. Led by Dr. Marvey, a renowned oncologist with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanor, they began the final preparations for Sonia's surgery. As the team checked vital signs and reviewed the procedure one last time, Ms. Abigail arrived, slightly out of breath from her early morning rush to the hospital. She immediately went to Sonia's side, taking the girl's free hand in hers. "Good morning, sweetheart," Ms. Abigail said, her voice filled with a mix of concern and encouragement. "Dr. Marvey is going to take very good care of you today. Do you remember what we talked about?" Sonia nodded, her grip tightening on both the coin and Ms. Abigail's hand. "They're going to make me sleep, and then they'll take out the bad stuff in my body," she recited, her voice small but steady. Dr. Marvey smiled approvingly. "That's exactly right, Sonia, and when you wake up, you'll be on your way to feeling much better." As the nurses began to prepare Sonia for transport to the operating room, Johnny noticed her panic rising. Her eyes darted around the room, her breathing becoming more rapid. Without hesitation, he stepped closer, taking her hand from Ms. Abigail. "Hey there, First Mate Sonia," he said softly, using his Jack Sparrow voice. "Remember what we talked about last night? About being brave?" Sonia nodded, her eyes locked on Johnny's face. "Well, this is your chance to show just how brave you are," he continued. "And do you know what? I'll be right here waiting for you when you wake up. Just like a faithful captain waiting for his first mate to return from a dangerous mission. What do you say?" Sonia took a deep breath, visibly calming herself. "Aye, aye, Captain," she whispered, managing a small smile. As the nurses began to wheel Sonia's bed out of the room, Johnny walked alongside, maintaining a steady stream of pirate-themed encouragement. He carried the hat and coin, promising to keep them safe until she returned. At the operating room doors, Sonia's fear resurfaced. She reached out for Johnny, her small hand trembling. Johnny knelt beside her gurney, speaking softly. "You've got this, Sonia," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Captain Jack Sparrow believes in you, and when you wake up, we'll have more adventures together. I promise." Sonia's grip on his hand loosened as the pre-surgery medication began to take effect. With a final, drowsy nod, she was wheeled into the operating room, the doors closing behind her. Johnny stood there for a moment, staring at the closed doors, before turning to Miss Abigail. They shared a look of nervous anticipation before making their way to the waiting area. As they settled into the uncomfortable chairs, Johnny's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find several missed calls and messages from his agent, publicist, and various business contacts. With a sigh, he silenced the device, his attention focused solely on the operating room indicator light. Miss Abigail noticed his action and gave him a sympathetic look. "Mr. Depp," she began hesitantly, "I can't help but feel that we're imposing on you. Your career, your obligations." Johnny shook his head firmly. "Miss Abigail, please, this is where I need to be right now. Everything else can wait." As the morning stretched on, Johnny and Miss Abigail sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts and prayers for Sonia. The waiting room slowly filled with other anxious families, creating a shared atmosphere of hope and fear. Hours passed, marked only by the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional updates from passing nurses. Johnny found himself pacing the small area, his eyes constantly drawn to the operating room doors, willing them to open with good news. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Marvey emerged, still in his surgical scrubs. Johnny and Miss Abigail stood immediately, their hearts racing as they waited for the news that would shape Sonia's future. Dr. Marvey approached Johnny and Miss Abigail, his face tired but wearing a cautiously optimistic expression. "The surgery was successful," he announced, his voice carrying a note of relief. "We were able to remove the primary tumor and the affected lymph nodes." Johnny and Miss Abigail embraced spontaneously, both fighting back tears of relief. "Thank God," Miss Abigail whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Dr. Marvey continued, his tone becoming more serious. "However, this is just the first step. Sonia will need ongoing treatment to ensure we've eliminated all the cancer cells. We're looking at a regimen of chemotherapy and possibly radiation, depending on how her body responds." Johnny nodded, his expression determined. "Whatever she needs, Doctor, just tell us what to do next." As Dr. Marvey outlined the next steps in Sonia's treatment plan, a nurse approached to inform them that Sonia was being moved to the recovery room and would be waking up soon. "She'll be groggy from the anesthesia," the nurse explained, "but you can see her briefly if you'd like." Johnny and Miss Abigail followed the nurse to the recovery area. As they approached Sonia's bed, they could see her starting to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on Johnny. "Captain Jack," she mumbled, her voice weak and slurred. Johnny stepped forward, gently placing the pirate hat back on her head, careful to avoid the surgical sites. "I'm here, First Mate Sonia," he said softly. "You did it. You were so brave." A weak smile spread across Sonia's face as she drifted back to sleep, the hat slightly askew on her bald head. As Sonia rested and Dr. Marvey excused himself after delivering the news, Johnny pulled Miss Abigail aside to discuss the path forward. His voice was calm but resolute. "I want to set up a fund," he said decisively, his eyes focused on both of them. "I mentioned yesterday about funding Sonia's continued treatment, but I want to commit more, specifically for the renovation and expansion of the orphanage as well. The city area may be limited, but we might find a more spacious location in the suburban area. There must be other orphans out there who need medical care they can't afford, and I was thinking we could set up a small clinic within the new orphanage, a place where they can get the care they deserve." Miss Abigail's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mr. Depp, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure? The costs could be astronomical." Johnny nodded firmly. "I'm sure I'll inform my assistant and my legal team can start drafting the paperwork immediately." As they discussed the details of the fund, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. A small group of children, no more than 5 or 6, were being ushered towards Sonia's room by a nurse and a young woman Johnny recognized as one of the orphanage staff. The nurse, looking slightly frazzled, was gently warning them, her voice hushed. "Please, keep it down and let Sonia rest," she said, ushering them along. The children, wide-eyed and clearly concerned, whispered among themselves as they caught sight of Sonia's room, their steps quickening with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The orphanage staff member, a kind-faced woman, kept close to them, her expression filled with both care and a hint of worry. "These are Sonia's closest friends from her dorm," Ms. Abigail explained. "They've been so worried about her." The children crowded around Sonia's bed, their excited whispers filling the room. One little boy spotted the pirate hat and gasped in awe. "Is she really friends with Captain Jack Sparrow?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Johnny chuckled, crouching down to the boy's level. "She certainly is," he said, slipping into his Jack Sparrow voice. "And let me tell you, she's the bravest pirate I've ever met." The children's eyes lit up as they recognized Johnny, but to his surprise and relief, they remained relatively calm, more interested in checking on their friend than in the celebrity in their midst. As the day wore on, Johnny found himself reading pirate stories to the small group of children, with Ms. Abigail watching from the couch, grateful tears in her eyes. The room was filled with the sound of childish giggles and dramatic gasps as Johnny brought the tales to life with his animated storytelling. Johnny paused in his storytelling to look at Sonia. She was awake now, still weak but smiling as she listened to the stories, surrounded by her friends. The golden coin rested on her bedside table, catching the last rays of sunlight, a symbol of the unexpected friendship that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. In that moment, Johnny felt a profound sense of purpose. He knew that his life had changed irrevocably since that chance encounter outside the hotel. There would be challenges ahead: Sonia's ongoing treatment, setting up the fund, balancing his career with his new commitments, but he was ready to face them all. As he resumed the story, weaving tales of brave pirates and grand adventures, Johnny silently renewed his promise to Sonia and the other children. He would use his resources and influence to make a difference in their lives, to give them the chance at health, happiness, and adventure that every child deserves. The hospital room, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had transformed into a haven of hope and new beginnings. And as Johnny looked around at the smiling faces of the children, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new, meaningful chapter in all their lives.